All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep on something pretty fundamental, wouldn't you say? I mean, it's a concept that really underpins so much of what we as, well, I guess you could say, fellow philosophy enthusiasts think about, right? That's certainty.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainty, it's one of those ideas that pops up everywhere in philosophy.
Oh, yeah, for sure. You see it in epistemology, metaphysics, ethics.
You name it. But what we're going to do today is, well, sort of go beyond just encountering the idea.
Right, not just a quick glance. We're going deep, a real deep dive into, what it actually means.
Exactly. And to do that, we're going to be using this awesome entry on certainty
Mm-hmm.
from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Oh, the S&P. Always a good starting point. But it's more than just a starting point for us today, right?
Right. This is going to be our roadmap for the whole journey. We really want to unpack how this idea of certainty has been understood, you know, throughout the history of philosophy. Why it's been such a, I guess you could say, a hot topic for debate for so long.
Oh, yeah, and still is. I mean, just think about all the different ways we use the word certain in everyday life.
Right. Like, I'm certain I locked the door, or I'm certain that 2 plus 2 equals 4.
But in philosophy, well, it gets a bit more, let's say, complex.
Oh, definitely more complex. We're not just talking about a feeling or hunch. We want to understand what makes a belief certain.
And whether such a thing, that kind of certainty is even possible to achieve.
Right. That's the big question, isn't it?
It is. And the SEP, it actually does a pretty good job of laying out, some of the different ways we can think about certainty. It distinguishes between, well, I guess you could say three main types: psychological certainty, epistemic certainty, and moral certainty.
And I think for our deep dive today, we'll be focusing mostly on epistemic certainty.
Yeah, the kind that has to do with, how strongly we can justify our beliefs.
Exactly. When can we say that we know something with absolute certainty?
Right, that's the kind of certainty that's really at the heart of philosophical inquiry. But let's just take a moment to unpack those other types first, just so we're all on the same page, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's start with psychological certainty. This is basically, that feeling of absolute conviction that a belief is true. It's that strong inner feeling like you just know it.
Like no doubt whatsoever.
Right, like it's just completely obvious to you. But, and this is important, this feeling of certainty, it's not always the same thing as what we call incorrigibility.
Incorrigibility, right? That's when someone is just, well, completely incapable of giving up a belief, no matter what evidence you throw at them.
Exactly. The ASEP, it gives this really powerful example. It talks about a mother who simply cannot accept that her son committed a crime, even when, all the evidence points to him.
Like even if she saw it with her own eyes, right? Like,
Yeah, even then, she might be psychologically certain of his innocence, like completely unable to let go of that belief. But, and here's the thing, that doesn't necessarily mean that she's not, you know, wrestling with some kind of doubt deep down.
that's a really interesting point. So just because someone feels absolutely certain, it doesn't mean that there's no possibility of doubt lurking somewhere in their mind.
Precisely. And the opposite can also be true. You can have what we call epistemic certainty, which means that your belief is really, really well supported by evidence.
Like you've got all the best reasons to believe it.
Exactly. But you might not necessarily feel that strong sense of conviction.
So you might be certain in a, let's say, objective sense,
Right. Because of the strength of the evidence.
but you might not have that subjective gut feeling certainty.
Yeah, and I think this distinction is really important to keep in mind, especially as we move into talking about epistemic certainty.
Mm.
Because, I mean, the focus there is really on the reasons we have for believing something.
Right. It's not about how strongly we feel about it, but about whether those feelings are justified.
Exactly. And then there's this third type of certainty that the Savvy talks about, moral certainty. And this is where things get a bit, well, more complicated.
Because it brings in this whole other dimension, right? It's not just about what we believe, but also about how those beliefs influence our actions and, well, I guess you could say our moral judgments.
Right, and the Sepio actually brings in Descartes and Spinoza on this. So, like, heavy hitters right off the bat.
Oh, yeah, they're not messing around. But what did they have to say about moral certainty?
Well, Descartes, in his principles, he kind of suggests that moral certainty is this level of certainty that's, good enough for us to live our lives.
Like to make decisions and stuff?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it doesn't quite reach the level of absolute certainty that, maybe God has.
So it's a kind of practical certainty.
Right, like it's enough for us to get by in the world, even if it's not, perfect or infallible.
But then, Descartes also talks about moral certainty in his Meditations, and there it seems to take on a slightly different flavor.
Oh, yeah, he just kind of shift the focus a bit there, doesn't he? In the Meditations, moral certainty seems to be more about, well, what it's reasonable for us to act on given our limited knowledge.
So it's like even if we acknowledge that something could be false, we might still be justified in acting as if it were true.
Exactly.
Mm.
It's about like what we can rationally rely on in our everyday lives. And then Spinoza comes along and he adds yet another layer to this whole moral certainty thing.
Oh, Spinoza, always got to add another layer.
He does. He really does. But it's a really insightful layer, I think. He distinguishes between moral certainty and mathematical certainty. He says that moral certainty, it actually has its own kind of value. It can give us comfort, it can be important for society to function, and it can be held, without causing any harm.
Especially, for people who maybe don't have the time or the ability to engage in deep philosophical reflection.
Right, exactly. And the Seppi makes it really clear that Spinoza isn't talking about, like, blind faith here. He's saying that there are good reasons to have moral certainty, even if those reasons aren't, absolutely foolproof.
So it's not just about feeling certain, but about having some kind of rational basis for that feeling.
Precisely. But as interesting as these other types of certainty are, the Vesep makes it clear that epistemic certainty has really been the main focus of philosophical inquiry.
Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of certainty that philosophers have been wrestling with for centuries.
And I think it's the kind that's most relevant to us today as we're, trying to understand the limits of human knowledge.
Right. When can we say that we truly know something? And what does it mean to know something with certainty?
So I think that's where we should focus our attention now. Let's dive into some of the ways that philosophers have actually tried to define and understand epistemic certainty.
All right, let's do it. Where do we even begin? I mean, certainty seems like such a, well, slippery concept.
Yeah, it definitely is. But I think one of the most foundational ways of thinking about epistemic certainty is through this idea of indubitability.
Indubitability, that's a mouthful.
It is, but it's basically the idea that a belief is certain if it can't be doubted.
Okay, that makes sense. So if you can't even imagine a scenario where the belief could be false, then it's indubitable.
Exactly. And the classic example here, of course, is Descartes' famous cogito, I think, therefore I am.
Ah, Descartes, the OG certainty seeker.
Right. He was all about finding that unshakable foundation for knowledge. And he thought he found it in the cogito. Because the idea is, even if you're doubting everything else, you can't doubt the fact that you're doubting.
So even in the face of the most extreme skepticism, that one belief seems to stand firm.
Exactly. And because you're doubting, you must be thinking.
Yeah.
And if you're thinking, well, you must exist.
So it's like this bedrock of certainty that can't be eroded by any doubt.
Right. But here's the thing, and the SEP actually points this out. Descartes didn't necessarily think that all certainty was based on indubitability.
Oh, really? So there's more to it than just being unable to doubt something.
All right. He also talks about this idea of clear and distinct perceptions as a source of certainty. Like when he's talking about his certainty that he's a thinking thing, he appeals to this idea of clear and distinct perception.
So it's not just about the impossibility of doubt, but also about the clarity and distinctness of our ideas.
Yeah, and of course, as the SF reminds us, this whole thing gets tied up with the existence of God in Descartes' later work, which adds a whole other layer of complexity to the discussion.
Oh yeah, Descartes and God, that's a whole other deep dive.
Definitely. But I think the important point here is that Descartes saw indubitability as one important source of certainty, but not necessarily the only one.
Okay, so there's more to the story than just being unable to doubt.
Got it.
But what about other philosophers? Did they buy into this whole indubitability thing?
Well, one philosopher who also connected certainty to indubitability was Wittgenstein.
Wittgenstein. Interesting. I wouldn't have immediately thought of him. What did he have to say about it?
Well, he talks about certainty in his work on certainty.
Yeah.
And he basically argues that the very act of doubting, it actually presupposes a framework of certainty.
Interesting. What do you mean by that?
Well, think about it. You can't just doubt everything at once.
Yeah, I guess that would be kind of, impossible.
Right. You need to have some kind of starting point, some beliefs that you take for granted in order to even begin doubting other things.
So there have to be some beliefs that are just like bedrock, untouchable.
Exactly. Wittgenstein called these hinge propositions.
Yeah.
They're the things that we just don't question. the things that form the foundation of our thought.
Okay, so these hinge propositions, they're like the axioms of our belief system.
Right. And Wittgenstein thought that these hinge propositions, they were certain in a really fundamental way.
But here's the question. Is that certainty epistemic? I mean, is it based on good reasons, or is it more like, well, psychological? Like, we just can't bring ourselves to doubt these things.
Yeah, that's a really important question. And the SEB actually raises this point. It says that when Wittgenstein talks about things like, the groundlessness of our believing, it suggests that these hinge propositions might be things that we're just psychologically incapable of questioning.
But that doesn't necessarily make them true, right?
Exactly. So is this certainty a certainty of belief, or is it more like a certainty of action?
Like, we just have to act as if these things are true, even if we can't fully justify them.
Right. And this actually leads to a pretty big problem for any account of certainty that's based on indubitability.
Oh, sounds like trouble. What's the problem?
Well, it's this kind of dilemma. Either we don't have good reasons for being unable to doubt a belief. In the case the certainty seems kind of, well, arbitrary. Like it's just a brute fact about our psychology.
It's just there, no real justification.
Right. Or if we do have good reasons for being unable to doubt a belief, then it seems like the certainty actually comes from those reasons, not from the indubitability itself.
So it's the justification that's doing the heavy lifting, not the feeling of certainty.
Exactly. And this raises the question of, well, what makes those reasons themselves certain? We've kind of just pushed the problem back a step.
Right, like an infinite regress of reasons. But the Sepeti also points out another problem with indubitability. Even beliefs that seem to have, like, the highest level of epistemic warrant, really good reasons to believe them, they can still be doubted in some sense.
Interesting. You mean like even if it seems really, really unlikely that the belief is false, there's still a sliver of possibility that it could be?
Yeah, exactly. Like, think about those really complex mathematical proofs. They might be, incredibly rigorous and almost everyone accepts them as true.
Right, like Fermat's last theorem or something.
Exactly. But there's always a tiny chance, however remote, that there's some subtle error that nobody's noticed yet.
So even in those cases where we have really strong justification, it seems like doubt is still, at least logically possible.
So maybe indubitability isn't quite the gold standard for certainty that we thought it was.
Right. And I think this is why a lot of philosophers have moved away from this idea of indubitability and started exploring other ways of thinking about certainty.
Like what? What are some of those other ways?
Well, one prominent conception of certainty is what's called infallibility.
Infallibility, okay. So this is about, like, being absolutely sure that a belief is true.
Right. But it's more than just being really, really confident. It's about the belief being guaranteed to be true. Like it couldn't possibly be false.
So it's like the truth of the belief is built into its very nature.
Exactly. Roderick Firth, he calls this the truth evaluating sense of certainty. And it definitely sets a higher bar than ordinary knowledge where, a belief can be true even if there was a real possibility of it being false.
Okay, so infallibility is about this kind of, like, necessary truth.
Right, like it couldn't have been any other way.
But, and I'm sure you see this coming, how do we define what it means for a belief to be something that could not have been false? That seems pretty tricky.
Oh, yeah, it definitely is. And the essay points out that it's not just about logical impossibility. Like, take the cogito again.
Yeah.
Even though I might be certain of my existence when I'm thinking, it's not logically necessary that I exist. I mean, there was a time before I existed, and there will probably be a time after I exist.
So the infallibility of the cogito, it's not grounded in logic.
Right. So if it's not logical necessity, then what is it? What makes a belief infallible?
Yeah, good question.
Well, some philosophers have tried to ground this infallibility in the reasons that someone has for believing something.
So it's like the reasons themselves guarantee the truth of the belief.
Right. But, as the Seppi carefully explains, this approach runs into a couple of pretty big problems. First of all, it seems like the certainty, it's actually coming from the strength and nature of those reasons, not from the belief itself being, like, intrinsically guaranteed to be true.
So we've kind of just shifted the problem again. Now we have to explain what makes those reasons infallible.
Exactly. It's like turtles all the way down.
And the second problem, well, this one's a bit more technical, but I think you'll appreciate it as someone who's, familiar with epistemology. It has to do with this idea of fallibilistic knowledge.
Fallibilistic knowledge, right.
Yeah.
That's the idea that we can know things even if we're not absolutely certain of them.
Exactly. But if certainty requires guaranteed truth, then how do we account for knowledge of necessary truths? Like if something just has to be true, then any justification we have for believing it, even if it's pretty weak, would technically guarantee its truth.
So the distinction between knowledge and certainty starts to blur, which seems kind of counterintuitive, right?
Definitely. I mean, we usually think of certainty as being a stronger condition than knowledge.
Right. So this infallibility approach, it seems like it runs into some pretty serious problems when we try to apply it to, the messy reality of human knowledge.
Okay, so infallibility is maybe not the answer either. What else is there?
Well, some philosophers have turned to probability to try to make sense of certainty.
Probability. Okay, so we're getting all mathematical now.
A bit, yeah. But it's actually a pretty intuitive way of thinking about certainty. The idea is that certainty is the point at which the probability of a belief being true, given all the available evidence, reaches one.
So it's like 100% certain, no chance of being wrong.
Exactly. But, and here's the catch, for the evidence to justify a probability of 1, it seems like the evidence itself would also have to have a probability of 1.
So we're back to that infinite regress problem again.
Yeah, it's tough to escape. And then there's this other idea that certain beliefs just have an intrinsic probability of 1.
Like they're just certain by their very nature.
Right. But that idea also faces some pretty big conceptual hurdles. It's not clear what it would even mean for a belief to have an intrinsic probability.
Okay, so probability is maybe not a perfect solution either. But what about this guy, Williamson? The CEPE mentions him and something about certainty over time.
Oh, yeah. Williamson is a big name in contemporary epistemology. And he raises a really interesting challenge to this whole probability approach. He basically asks, even if a belief has a probability of 1 at a particular moment in time, does that mean it's absolutely certain?
What do you mean?
Well, he's thinking about the possibility that new evidence could come along in the future that might undermine the belief, even if it seems certain right now.
So it's like even if something seems 100% certain today, we can't be sure that it will still seem certain tomorrow.
Right, because new information could change everything. But the essay clarifies that Williamson's main concern is actually with the stability of knowledge over time, not necessarily with certainty at a specific moment.
Okay, so he's not saying that we can't be certain of anything in the present moment.
No, not necessarily. He's just saying that certainty that endures over time might be a bit more elusive.
I see. So this temporal dimension of certainty adds a whole other layer of complexity to the discussion.
It really does.
Yeah.
But I think it's an important layer to consider, especially when we're thinking about, how our beliefs can change over time as we acquire new knowledge.
Okay, so we've looked at indubitability, infallibility, and probability as ways of understanding certainty. But the CEPE also talks about this idea of inimitability. What's that all about?
Yeah, inimitability. It's another way of trying to get at what makes a belief certain. And the basic idea here is that certainty isn't about guaranteed truth or impossibility of doubt. It's about having the best possible justification for a belief.
So it's like if you've got the strongest reasons to believe something, then that makes it certain.
Exactly. Roderick Firth, he calls this the warrant evaluating sense of certainty. And it seems pretty intuitive, right? Like, if you've got the best possible evidence, what more could you ask for?
Yeah, it makes sense. But what exactly does it mean to have the best possible justification? How do we measure that?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. And the essay actually points out a few problems with trying to define certainty in terms of justification.
Oh no, more problems.
I know, it's like every approach we look at has its own set of issues. But I think these problems are worth considering.
Like, what are they?
Well, one problem is that if we just say that the best possible justification is the strongest justification that you happen to have, or even the strongest justification that anyone currently has, well, that could still be pretty weak.
Like, if everyone's operating with limited information or flawed reasoning, then the best justification available might not be all that great.
Exactly. So it seems like we need something more objective than just whatever happens to be the strongest justification someone has.
Okay, so maybe it means the highest level of justification that's possible, even if nobody actually has it.
Yeah, that's one way to go. But even that formulation has problems. Like, what if global skepticism is true?
Global skepticism, right. That's the idea that we can't really know anything about the external world.
Exactly. And if global skepticism is true, then it seems like even our best justified beliefs about the world might not be all that well justified.
So this highest possible justification standard might be unattainable.
Right. And a good account of certainty, it shouldn't just assume that skepticism is false. It needs to address that challenge head on.
Okay, so it seems like we need some way of grounding justification that's immune to skeptical worries.
Exactly. But that's a pretty tall order.
It is. But the SE also talks about this philosopher, Chisholm, who offers a few different ways of defining certainty in terms of justification.
Oh yeah, Chisholm. He was a big fan of trying to analyze philosophical concepts in a really precise way.
So, what were his takes on certainty?
Well, he had a couple of definitions. One of them was that a belief is certain if it's more reasonable to accept it than to withhold it, and if there's no other belief that it's more reasonable to accept.
Okay, so it's like it's the most reasonable belief to hold given the available evidence.
Right. But the SFP points out that this definition, it still allows for the possibility that your most reasonable belief might not be all that well supported.
Like it could still be pretty flimsy even if it's the best you've got.
Right. So Chisholm also offered a second definition, which tries to set a higher bar for certainty. He said that believing a proposition P has to be more justified than withholding any proposition Q, and at least as justified as believing any Q.
Wow, that's a pretty high bar.
It is. But the SFP points out that this definition might actually set the bar too high. Like, think about some completely random proposition, like the total number of living things on Earth being even.
Okay, I have no idea if that's true or false.
Right, and neither do I. But according to Chisholm's definition, we wouldn't be certain of anything because there will always be some random proposition like that that we're not more justified in believing than withholding.
So it seems like we're stuck between a rock and a hard place here. If we set the bar too low, then certainty becomes too easy to achieve. But if we set it too high, then it becomes almost impossible to achieve.
Yeah, it's a tough balance to strike. And the SEP also points out that Chisholm's definitions, they seem to rely on this kind of contingent fact about our ignorance.
What do you mean?
Well, they rely on the fact that there are all these propositions out there that we just don't have any strong opinions about. But what if we were omniscient? What if we knew everything?
Then Chisholm's definitions wouldn't work anymore.
Right. So it seems like our definition of certainty shouldn't depend on the fact that we're limited in our knowledge.
Okay, that makes sense. But the SCP also brings up another problem with Chisholm's definitions. They seem to be subject relative.
Subject relative, what does that mean?
Well, it means that what counts as certain for one person might not count as certain for another person. Like someone who has a generally less justified set of beliefs might consider a particular belief certain, even if someone with a more well-supported set of beliefs wouldn't.
So certainty would be kind of like in the eye of the beholder.
Exactly. And that seems problematic if we're trying to develop a, objective account of certainty.
Right. Certainty shouldn't just be a matter of personal opinion.
Okay, so Chisholm's definitions, they run into some problems too. But he also had this other idea, particularism, which is a bit different from his justification-based definitions.
Oh yeah, particularism. That's where things get even more interesting.
Tell me about it. What's particularism all about?
Well, instead of trying to define certainty in terms of some general principle like indubitability or justification, Chisholm thought we should just look at clear cases of certainty and work from there.
So it's like start with the things that we're absolutely sure of and then try to figure out what they have in common.
Exactly. And the examples he gives are things like our awareness of our own mental states, like, I know that I'm thinking right now.
Yeah, can't really doubt that.
Right. And then there are things like logical and mathematical axioms, those basic truths that seem self-evident.
Like 2 + 2 = 4 or the law of non-contradiction.
Right. So Chisholm thought we should start with these paradigms of certainty and then try to develop a more general understanding from there.
Okay, so it's kind of like an inductive approach to certainty.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
But of course, this approach has its own set of challenges.
I'm sensing a pattern here.
Yeah. It seems like every attempt to define certainty runs into some kind of obstacle.
So what are the problems with particularism?
Well, one problem is that it just kind of pushes the problem back a step. Like, how do we know that these paradigms of certainty, these things that seem so self-evident, are actually certain?
Yeah, that's a good question. We're taking them as our starting point, but we haven't really justified that starting point.
Right. And then there are all these debates in epistemology about, how we can have knowledge of necessary truths, like those logical and mathematical axioms.
Like, how do we know that those things have to be true, regardless of how the world happens to be?
Right. And then there's this other problem, the speckled hen problem.
The speckled hen problem. That sounds interesting.
It is. It basically has to do with whether we can really know every detail of our own sensory experiences just by having them.
Like if I'm looking at a speckled hen, do I really know everything about its appearance, or are there some subtle details that I'm missing?
Right. And if we can't even know all the details of our own sensory experiences, well, that raises some doubts about whether those experiences can really be paradigms of certainty.
So it seems like particularism might be resting on a shaky foundation.
Yeah, it's not without its problems.
Hmm.
But I think it's a really interesting approach, and it highlights this idea that maybe we need to start with our intuitions about certainty and then try to build a more rigorous account from there.
Okay, so we've looked at a bunch of different approaches to certainty, and they've all run into some kind of snag. Is there anything else out there?
Well, the Asip also talks about this idea of indefeasibility.
Indefeasibility. Okay, this is a new one.
It is. And it's particularly associated with a philosopher named Peter Klein. He argues that for a belief to be absolutely certain, it has to be both subjectively and objectively immune to doubt.
Subjectively and objectively immune to doubt. What does that even mean?
Okay, so subjective immunity, it means that you're warranted in denying any belief that if you added it to your current set of beliefs, would weaken your justification for the beliefs you're trying to hold as certain.
So it's like your belief is so strong that no other belief could possibly shake it.
Right. And then objective immunity, it means that there's no true belief out there anywhere in the universe that could weaken your justification if you added it to your set of beliefs.
Wow, that's a really high bar.
It is. It's basically saying that your belief is completely unshakable, both from your own perspective and from the perspective of, like, objective reality.
Okay, I can see why he calls it indefeasibility. But the SEP raises some questions about this approach too, right?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Like I said, every approach to certainty seems to have its own set of problems.
So what are the problems with indefeasibility?
Well, one problem is that it's not clear how one belief can reduce the warrant for another belief. Like if I believe that I have a headache and then someone tells me that I don't have a headache, does that really weaken my justification for believing that I have a headache?
That's a good question. I mean, it seems like adding a contradictory belief should weaken your justification, but it's not immediately obvious how that works.
Right. And if we just say that any contradictory belief automatically weakens justification, then it seems like no belief could ever be absolutely certain.
Because there will always be some possible contradictory belief out there.
Exactly. So maybe we need to think about warrant reduction in a more nuanced way.
Okay, so subjective immunity might be a bit trickier than it first appears. What about objective immunity?
Well, the ASEP uses this thought experiment about a guardian angel to illustrate a problem with objective immunity. Imagine that you have a belief, and let's say your justification for that belief is actually pretty weak.
Okay, so it's not a very strong belief to begin with.
Right. But now imagine that there's a guardian angel who's watching over you, and this angel makes sure that any evidence that could disprove your belief is false.
So the angel is basically protecting your belief from being disproven.
Exactly. But even though there's no true belief out there that can undermine your justification, it seems like your belief is still not really certain.
Because the justification itself was weak to begin with.
Right. So objective immunity, it seems like it's not enough to guarantee certainty on its own. You need to have a strong justification in the first place.
Okay, so indefeasibility, it has its own set of problems too. It seems like every attempt to define certainty just runs into a wall.
It does kind of feel that way, doesn't it?
It does, but the SEP, it doesn't end there. It actually goes on to discuss another important dimension of certainty, the difference between certainty at a moment in time and certainty that lasts over time.
Oh yeah, that's a really crucial distinction. And it's one that Descartes was particularly concerned with.
Descartes, always thinking about the long game.
He was. He wanted to find a system of knowledge that was not only certain in the present moment, but also stable and lasting.
So it wouldn't be undermined by new discoveries or changing circumstances.
Exactly. But this idea of certainty over time, it actually raises some interesting challenges. Like, how do we know that our beliefs will still be certain in the future?
Yeah, what if something happens that changes our understanding of the world?
Right. And this actually came up in a famous objection to Descartes' views on certainty. It's called Mersenn's objection.
All right,